Well, hello and welcome to the Nifty Travel Podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
No, you're very welcome. So, the first thing I always like to ask my guests is about your earliest memories of travel.
Oh, my earliest memories of travel. Well, my family did a lot of traveling when I lived with my parents back in the UK. And so we would often go to somewhere abroad during Christmas time because my mum wanted to get away from the cold. So we would go somewhere warmer. And so we went to a lot of different places, and yeah, we kind of went around the world quite a lot, and so we ended up going to lots of sort of city breaks and things like that. And but I think my earliest memory that's just like a sort of haze is of seeing these big pillars that I thought were Greek pillars, and I thought we were in Greece. And later on, I was talking to my mom about this, and it turns out we were in Scotland because there's the place on Carlton Hill in Edinburgh. And I thought that I was looking at these ancient Greek ruins, but it was actually just back in the UK.
Ah, fantastic. So, do you think those early experiences were a sign of what was to come for you?
In terms of travel, I don't know. I mean, I think actually I took it for granted. I kind of thought of travel as just like a given, something that I would always be doing. And so I don't think I thought too deeply about it. When I was at university, I was actually on the university newspaper. And so whilst I was there, I was a features editor. And so I would write about different pretty much anything that I wanted to. But for some reason I had this idea that sort of lifestyle and travel was like not as, I don't know, journalistic. And so at the time, I didn't think that I wanted to write about travel. But once I got out of university and I moved to Japan and I wanted to travel around Japan, then I realized actually, yeah, I do want to write about travel. It's a really fun and interesting thing to write about. And also, it's a really important way to connect with another culture as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned Edinburgh. That was obviously an important time for you. Tell me a bit about it.
Um, do you mean during university or that time when I was very small?
Well, both, I guess. I mean, it's
Okay. Well, I think I'll talk about the university one because I don't remember anything other than the pillars from when I was very small. So what do you want to know about Edinburgh?
well, it's a well-known international city. People get an impression of it. I mean, did your time in there show you another side of Edinburgh that perhaps the 1 weeker or the 2 weeker uh, visitor misses?
Yeah, well, I mean, during my time as a student, then I have to say most of my time spent was spent drinking and sort of partying and doing things that are not so much the tourism level of entertainment. But I did get to actually work as a runner for the BBC during the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which is like a sort of month long festival of different shows like theatre and comedy and all sorts of performances. And so during that time, that was actually my first experience of the Fringe Festival. And it was working for like a major player at the festival. And so that was very interesting because I kind of got to see a little bit behind the scenes and kind of how things work. And I also obviously spent a lot of time at the actual BBC part of it. So I saw a few shows. But because I was there with a few friends from university and stuff, then we also went and saw a couple of the other shows. We saw a lot of the free shows, a lot of the less expensive ones. But yeah, it was a very interesting vibe. It's not something that I've experienced elsewhere. Um, and then in terms of just sort of daily life in Edinburgh, like the city itself I really like because it's just got so much character to it. Like it's a very sort of traditional British city. Like there's a lot of the sort of stone walls and things like that. And so it has like a nice vibe to it, but it also has like the kind of less nice areas as well, which you kind of get exposed to whilst you're living there, and it just feels like more of a it feels like a bit of a second home to me actually.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree with you. There's a lot happening in Edinburgh. It's one of those places that never seems to stand still.
Yeah. Have you been there yourself a lot?
Yeah, one or two times. I just found it one of those places that I wanted to keep going back to because it's just different every time I went,
Yeah.
and it's changed. It's changed enormously. Uh,
Mm.
Last 10 years, I would say,
Yeah.
despite its hundreds and thousands of years of history.
Yeah.
So, because obviously you now have a very strong link with Japan, did
Mhm.
the seed of that idea begin in university time, or did that come by another route?
It was actually before that. So that's actually why I ended up at Edinburgh University, is because when I was at school, so secondary school, then I had an interest in languages already. So I was studying French and Spanish. But then I had some half Japanese, half British friends who would sometimes speak in Japanese and I'd have no idea what they were saying. And I was like, ooh, like, what are they gossiping about over there? And then they showed me some films by Studio Ghibli. I don't know if you're familiar with Studio Ghibli. They've done things like Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke, those kind of films. Basically, they're anime, so they're like cartoons, but they have a lot more cultural importance, like a lot more depth to them. They have a lot of very deep storylines to do with man versus nature and that kind of thing. And so they're feature length films. And some of my friends showed me one of these films, and I was actually really interested in the subtitles because they actually had some Japanese subtitles on them. And I was like, wow, this language is so completely different to anything I've ever known or studied. And I wanted to understand these characters. I wanted to sort of crack the code. I wanted to know how to read that. And so I decided that I wanted to do French and Japanese at university, but that doesn't really exist so much in the UK. Like you can do French as a major and then Japanese as a minor, but I really wanted Japanese to be my major, and so I couldn't do Japanese major and then French minor. So I ended up going to Edinburgh where I could do Japanese as my major, but then they kind of have a slightly different system to the English system where it's a little bit more like America. So in the first year or two, then you can do different modules. So you can do things that are outside your major. And so I did French during that time. And then I had to stop partway through the course, but I just focused on Japanese. And then yeah, so that's why I ended up at Edinburgh actually. And then in my third year, I was in Tokyo on my year abroad, and then I went back for my fourth year in Edinburgh. And then as soon as I graduated, I basically I had about 6 months between graduation and then moving to Japan.
So, well, you've really sort of directed me to my next question, really. So you clearly were so curious that you thought, well, I have to go to Japan a gap year. So how did your what you thought Japan would be like uh, to what it was in reality? How did it hit you?
So actually, as I said, I went on a lot of trips with my family when I was younger. So we actually went to Japan on a family trip when I was about 16, I think. And so that was my first actual real life experience of Japan. That was around when I was starting to get that interest, and I was thinking that I wanted to do it as my major when I went to university. And so that was the main reason we went, is that I was interested. Um, so we went for about, I think it was about 10 days, and we did what's called the Golden Route, which is Tokyo and then Kyoto and Osaka. And that was really fun. And I remember my mum, I was talking to my mum about it a few years later, and then she said something about, oh yes, I just remember that day that it was bucketing down with rain, and oh my gosh, my feet were so wet that day. And I was like, it was, when did it rain? And I like didn't even remember that. And she was like, oh yes, you were definitely looking at Japan with your rose tinted spectacles there. I just really enjoyed the time. And then when I thought a bit more about it, I was like, oh yeah, there was that day when it was just absolutely pouring down with rain, like rain that you don't really often see in the UK, because it's just like proper sort of almost like monsoon kind of style. Um, but yeah, that was really fun. And I think that was because at that point I didn't really have a proper idea of what Japan was like. I sort of had some vague ideas, but I didn't think that it was going to be anything like the anime films that I had watched or anything like that. So I think I was just excited, and then we ended up. So I have a younger brother, and we went to like the Pokemon Center, and we bought like a little Pikachu, and we went to the castles and stayed in all these interesting places and stuff. I guess the thing that was difficult for me, or that was like a bit of a culture shock for me at the time, was the food. I was a very picky eater when I was a teenager. And so yeah, that's something that was difficult at the time. And now I'm like the complete opposite, and I really love exploring Japanese food.
Yes, and you not only like Japanese food, but you've kind of taken it to another level, haven't you? So you, I mean, we all start as you describe as being picky eaters. I mean, I didn't, I used to complain about the color of food.
Right.
It didn't have anything to do with taste, but eventually I got over that. So what is it about Japanese food then that really sort of caught your interest, your intrigue?
Well, being a Brit myself, I would say that most of the time when you go around the UK, most of the food is pretty similar. Like you get a few sort of regional varieties and things like that. But in Japan, the regional varieties are insane. Like there are so many. There's just an infinite number of different regional dishes, and each region has its own dish that it's really proud of, but also its own produce that it's really proud of. So, like different regions. So, for example, Ibaraki is known for its lotus root and something called natto, which is fermented soybeans, whereas Saitama is known for its sweet potatoes. Like all of these different places have their different specific regional foods, and then they make specific regional dishes out of those as well. And so pretty much every region has its own type of ramen, for example. And I just really love that variety and sort of sense of exploration. Like, I think it really ties in with travel because it feels like another element of adventure to be able to try something new everywhere that you go.
Yeah, it is an adventure, isn't it? Food, particularly as you were saying about how much variety you've discovered. I mean, I guess it's partially um, because of the geography of Japan, isn't it? I mean, it's a much bigger region. There's lots of islands, um, and I guess that naturally has meant that food and growing has changed. Well, as Yeah, it's different in all the places, isn't it? So
Yeah, I mean, they have a lot of it's a very mountainous country as well. So a lot of places will be either proud of the fact that they have all this food from the mountains and like this beautiful water that is best for their, I don't know, their sake making or something like that. And then some places will be like, oh, we have the mountains and the sea. We have all of the ingredients that you could possibly want, and they really do sort of tie into that geography as part of the narrative of the region's cuisine as well. Have you ever been to Japan yourself?
no, but I'm getting more curious by the moment.
You should definitely go. It's a great place.
So you were interested in languages before you set your heart on Japan, and I think I read that one of the things you did was teaching English as a foreign language. So I suppose there's a degree of crossover in that, isn't there? Uh,
Yeah, to be honest, um, being an English teacher in Japan is one of the easiest ways to get into the country in the first place. And as an English native speaker, that is. And I knew that I would be like relatively good at it with my language background and sort of. I like kids, but I also like teaching adults, and that was what it was. There was a whole range of different ages. So I did use it mainly to get into the country in the first place, but I did enjoy my time doing that as well.
so you mentioned that you do translation, but also this thing called transcreation. I've not actually heard this phrase before, but perhaps you could tell me what it is.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know that it's a term that people often use. I think just a few translators like to use that term, but basically it means not a one-to-one translation, because quite often you can get things that have been very, very directly translated and it ends up sounding quite unnatural in English, or just a bit off in some way. And so transcreation, what I mean by it is kind of taking the information and making it more suited towards an English speaking audience. So that might mean, it's got the exact same information in it, but I've got to put like a little bit of a twist on it. Maybe you need a few more descriptors, for example, because sometimes you can end up with like a very long sentence in Japanese that doesn't actually necessarily, it says like, oh, we have this, and this, but it doesn't necessarily say like, oh, we have these gorgeous fields or this delicious ice cream or whatever. It might sometimes just say, we have this thing and this thing. And then so by saying that in a pamphlet or something, it's not going to sound very exciting. But also on the opposite side, then you can sometimes get very, very wordy and flowery phrases in Japanese that actually have a lot of words that kind of are just repeating themselves if you translate it into English. So you kind of need to adjust to the market, basically.
Yeah, well, it sounds interesting, doesn't it? I mean, it speaks volumes actually of how language uh, evolves. Um, do you find that the British are sometimes known as being a little reserved? Do you think the Japanese have similar tendencies? It takes a while to get to know a Japanese person.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that a lot. I think that there are a lot of parallels between British and Japanese culture and sort of the way that we communicate. But actually, potentially even more so in Japanese, because in Japanese, there are actually different levels of politeness built into the language. So, for example, you can say to your friend, Ohayo, and that means like good morning, but you have to say to someone that you don't know as well, or who's like your boss or something, you would need to say ohayo gozaimasu. You need to put that like polite thing on the end there. And so it's really built into the language, and it takes a long time to grasp every level of it, because there's there's the most casual one, which is also the shortest. Then there's a medium polite one, which you use for people that you don't really know very well, or that are maybe like one level above you in the company or something like that. And then there's a whole other level on the top, which is for clients and for your boss's boss and like
Oh,
that kind
wow.
of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's depth and there's hidden depth in all cultures. Um, and you only get it when you stick around for a while. You start hearing the language being used in different situations.
Yeah.
So, in terms of storytelling, that's something you like. How have you been able to weave storytelling into well, travel stories?
Um, storytelling. It depends on the article, because sometimes it is mainly about just the information of a place. But I think that actually those ones are less common than the ones that I can put a story into. So there's just like different levels of storytelling in each one, I think. And yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think actually there's a lot of variation in how I do storytelling in my articles, because sometimes there are things where it's mainly about me traveling, but more often than not, I think it would be more about someone who's doing something interesting in a region, or who has their own soy sauce brewery, for example, or something like that, where you want to get a bit of the history of the place and then kind of tie that in with modern day and what this person is doing now. So, yeah, it really depends on the story itself, I think.
Yeah. No, I think you're right actually, because it depends. All stories depend on what the purpose of the story is. Uh,
Yeah.
very important. So you've obviously had a chance to travel to quite a few countries. So
Mhm.
was there a point where you suddenly felt like a digital nomad?
I wouldn't say that I am a digital nomad, because I am really based in Japan. I think I sort of think about the idea of being that kind of like a full-on digital nomad, of like going to another country and then just writing travel writing or travel vlogging or whatever it is in another country for a while, and then moving to another one and moving to another one. But I think logistics wise, I feel like I would need to because you need to have a base somewhere, right? Like you need to have a visa somewhere, like a visa that comes from somewhere. So like I would need to, I guess, put my parents' place as in the UK as my base, and then go to other places, because I'm not sure that I could. I don't know if I could even do it from like having a home in Japan and then move, like going to these other places. So yeah, I would mostly say that I'm actually not so much a digital nomad, more of like an immigrant or an expat or whatever you want to call it, that has moved to Japan, because I've now been here for 6 years, I think.
Yeah, well,
Mm.
that's good. That's a good chunk of time. You obviously love it there.
Yeah.
So one of the things you also like is photography. So is that something that's been of interest to you a long time, or is it something you thought, well, now I'm in Japan, I better go and record things?
Well, yeah, I've actually been interested in photography since I was a teenager, and my dad got me for one of my birthdays, I think my 16th birthday. It was like a very big present of a Canon DSLR, and I used that for at least 10 years, I think. It was a very long time that that thing stayed with me. And so I was quite interested in photography, but I never fully studied it. I kind of just took a lot of pictures and like tried to see how they went, and I was using the automatic setting for a very long time. It wasn't until I think I think it wasn't until I moved to Japan that I actually properly started using the different settings and actually taking manual photos and figuring out how to take manual photos and how to line things up and make them look nicer in a more thoughtful way. So I started taking more and more travel pictures, and that, like, I always take my camera when I go anywhere, pretty much. And I started using them to accompany my writing, and then I guess from there I just ended up using my camera more and more and more, and getting like frustrated with certain limitations of my own, and then having to look up like how to deal with those limitations. And even now I still have things where I'm like, I have no idea how to make a photo look like that. When I see, I don't know, something on the National Geographic or something, I'm like, wow, that's such a good photo. And so it's just about, for me anyway, learning bits and pieces as I go. Like, for example, I recently had a photo shoot at a hotel, and I had also just previously been on a coverage trip where we had a separate photographer, and the separate photographer had brought his tripod, and he was often, taking the picture on a timer and putting, like, changing the ISO and changing all of the settings so that there would be more brightness coming into the photo. And even though I knew all of this stuff, I hadn't really put it into practice myself. And so when I had this hotel shoot, I was like, okay, I definitely need to do the same. So I need to take my tripod and make sure that I have it on a timer so that I can have like a slower shutter speed so that I get in as much light as possible, because I know from experience of going to these different hotels that it's going to be quite dark. So yeah, so it's just a question of like learning along the way. And yeah, I ended up taking some photos that I'm pretty proud of at the hotel. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer.
So yeah, so you've learned to become more aware of your surroundings then.
Yeah, it's kind of a question of, I guess, not so much learning to be aware of the surroundings as being able to potentially foresee what those surroundings are going to be like. So, for example, I've been to a lot of restaurants now, and like quite a lot of hotels as well. And so I know, generally speaking, they like to keep them kind of moody lighting. And even when it's not moody lighting, it can seem like normal lighting to our eyes. But when you try and take a picture on a DSLR, then it looks really dark. And so you need to kind of deal with that without making it all grainy, for example. So knowing in advance what you're going to be shooting definitely helps with like, okay, I definitely need to bring my tripod. Okay, I need to bring a light. Okay, I need to bring this, that, and the other. So yeah, just having that experience and knowing what to expect out of something is definitely helpful.
Yeah. Oh, no, you do have to think ahead, don't you?
Yeah.
So when you're out and about, are there particular places and scenes that you like to capture?
I think I do love taking pictures of food. I But I do get kind of a little bit, what's the word? Like a little bit embarrassed when I take pictures of food when I'm just on my own trip and I go to a restaurant or something. I tend not to actually get out my big camera to take pictures of the food during that kind of thing. I tend to just do the thing on my phone because it feels much more normal to be able to do that. But when I have like an actual shoot, and like I know that the person knows that I'm taking a picture for official purposes, it feels much more, I don't feel any kind of embarrassment there. It's my own like hang up. But yeah, so I like taking that and like figuring out how to make it look the tastiest version of itself possible. But in terms of outside of food, then I think I just generally like, I don't know. I think just like capturing anything that sort of speaks to me a little bit. I actually also do Japanese calligraphy, and my teacher has shown me a bit of sumie, which is like the ink painting. And so very recently, I went to a museum that had this beautiful traditional Japanese pine tree out the front, and I just thought this is so like the kind of tree that you always see in like every traditional Japanese art piece. And so I had to take a picture of this tree, and it's just a tree. Like it's not like, I don't know, it's it's not this beautiful format or anything. It's just a pretty tree, and I really liked the branches. So I took a picture of that. So I just like take a picture of anything that speaks to me, and depending on the purpose of it, then I'll spend more time taking a picture of it, or I might just snap it literally just for the memory, or to put on like an Instagram story or something like that. Yeah, it just depends on what I see, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's fun to investigate and try and capture things that are unusual, aren't they?
Yeah, do you take any pictures yourself?
I do. I don't do it professionally. I just do it, like you were describing. Have my
Mm.
pocket all the time. Might as
Yeah.
well from time to time.
Yeah.
Um, that's really how it works. I love the rawness of either pictures or videos.
Mm.
Yeah, I think you kind of lose something. I always feel when you get into the editing because you're always having to make decisions on what to cut.
Right, yeah.
Do
Yeah,
you,
I do find the editing part is the most time consuming when I have photos that I have to submit. Like that hotel one that I was talking about, I took so many photos, and I have to delete so many of them because they're only going to use about four, and I've taken 1,000. So so it's yeah, that's always hard.
do you ever find when taking lots of photos that you notice things later that you didn't notice um, whilst you were in a given location?
Yeah. Hmm. I mean, because once you put it onto your computer screen, then obviously the screen is much bigger, so you can see a lot more of the details more easily. And so you can like notice if something is out of focus, or if there's like something off in the background or something like that that maybe you didn't notice at the time. But I think having the experience of taking so many, definitely helps thinking about that on the spot as well. So thinking about like, okay, this kind of looks good here, but like my focus, my depth of field could be a little off here because I've got like such a thin like amount of focus going on, that maybe I should, expand that a little bit, expand the aperture a little bit, so that I can definitely get in everything that I need to. And then once I come back to my computer later, I can see which one looks better, because maybe that bokeh, the sort of fuzziness, the blurriness in the background is a bit too much, or like I haven't got enough of the actual object in focus, that kind of thing. So having like a couple of them to choose from is helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, one of the things uh, I see about Japan from a distance is that um, I get the impression that one of the best ways to travel around Japan is by train. Is Would you say that's true, or just one of many ways?
I think there's definitely truth in it, especially if you can't drive or you're trying to be more eco-friendly, because Japan is very, very well connected by public transport and trains. I mean, especially compared to the UK. In the UK, the trains are always, late or cancelled. Or I found myself getting very frustrated when I went back to the UK recently, and I had to go through a kind of somewhat of a hub station. And in doing that, then I was looking online for how to get to the place that I was going to. And I was waiting on platform 2 because it said platform 2. And then all of a sudden, there was an announcement that said, no, this train is now going to be coming from platform 4. And so I had to run across to the other platform just to get there, and then find that they have now changed it back to platform 2. And then I had missed the train. so, so yeah, there's not a lot of that in Japan. There's things are sometimes cancelled or are a bit late in some way, but most of the time they're pretty on time. And if they are cancelled, or something happens because of weather conditions like a typhoon, as opposed to a little bit of rain or a little bit of snow that you would get in the UK, then they properly help you get on a next train, and it's very easy to get a refund or some kind of reimbursement or something. But anyway, to your original question of whether it's a good way of getting around, then yes, it's really good for getting to major cities. And there are generally trains to most places, even quite remote, buses to quite remote places. So there'll be a train to a relatively remote place, and then there'll be a bus to the very remote location that you're trying to get to. But sometimes those buses can be a bit sporadic, like there's not very many in a day. So if you're trying to see things that are more off the beaten path, then renting a car is the best way to have the most freedom to see all of those little bits and pieces, because Japan is huge. So yeah, it can be difficult to just traverse it by bus.
And is that also what? So there are several major islands, aren't there, and presumably lots
Mhm.
of smaller ones. So some of the islands will be very well connected, and I guess some you have to jump on a ferry of some description.
Yeah, so the main island is called Honshu, which is the one that has Tokyo and Kyoto and those kind of places on it. And then there's a couple of other ones. There's the northern one is Hokkaido, and then the southern one is Okinawa. And then Okinawa has a bunch. I think there's several hundred smaller islands that are sort of a part of the Okinawan region. And you can go to, and there's also actually one in the center as well. And you can go to these different islands quite easily. So you can get the Shinkansen is the bullet train. You can get a Shinkansen now to Hokkaido, which is the northern island. That's a relatively recent update. You can't get a train to Okinawa because there is a huge chunk of sea in the middle. But you can fly from Tokyo to Okinawa, and then Okinawa has, I believe, one train line because it's a relatively small island. And then yeah, Hokkaido is mostly just a lot of nature. So there's some good train lines between the two sort of major cities up there, and then after that, there's a huge national park and mountains and things. So it gets a lot more remote to that side of Hokkaido.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Japan is very diverse. Um, do you have favorite places that you've visited? Perhaps places that surprised you?
I guess I really liked Kagoshima. There is an active volcano there, and it's called Sakurajima, and it's actually really beautiful. You can see it from quite a few different places throughout Kagoshima city. This is quite a southern city, and it's yeah, I have this image of Sakurajima volcano at sunset just living rent free in my mind. It's such a pretty scene, and it's also surprising in a way that the culture towards the south of Japan is actually quite different to sort of the culture of Tokyo. So if you go, so Kagoshima is the southernmost part before you go down to Okinawa, and Okinawa is, to me, kind of like the Hawaii of Japan. Like, it's so laid back and tropical vibes, and it's just so different. And so Kagoshima is kind of in between that, where it's still a bit of the city kind of life, but it's also a bit more laid back and just sunny and happy and a nice place to be.
Mm. No, it sounds like you've found some interesting places. I noticed you did a video where you were expressing that you weren't terribly keen on crowded places. Is that because we often think of Japan as being a very busy place, but you've also described there's lots of places to get away from crowds. Big national parks you mentioned, and perhaps going up into the mountains. Do you feel that Japan is got lots of hidden gems that people overlook?
Definitely. Definitely. There are so many places that are very, very quiet, but still have interesting things to see. In that video, I was actually specifically talking about Kyoto because Kyoto is experiencing some horrendous over tourism right now. And so over tourism is not just it's not just that it's like kind of crowded, it's that it is so crowded that it's really hard to even move through a few places. And there's a lot of that happening in Tokyo as well. So there's a place called Harajuku, and there's this one little street in Harajuku that everyone loves to go to, and it is just a sea of people. Like, if you go down there, you can't walk at your own pace. You just have to like be a part of the crowd as you go down this street. So the places that everyone knows the name of, so Tokyo and Kyoto and Osaka, are very, very crowded. And then after that, places like Hiroshima are still kind of crowded because people still know them, but they're a bit like less so. But then there are all these places that people just do not know about. So obviously, it's not just Western tourists in Japan who go to these places. There are actually a lot of Taiwanese and Chinese and other Asian tourists in Japan. Particularly, there's a lot of Taiwanese and Chinese tourists, and so they know a bit more. Well, they know a lot more about Japan than the average, like, Brit, for example. And like, there's a lot of people from Taiwan who actually go to Japan multiple times a year. So they know kind of more of the places that a Brit might consider off the beaten path, but they're actually quite popular in terms of overall tourism. But outside of even those, there are also tons of like small cities that and towns that maybe the average Japanese person would find boring, but I think anyone who lives outside of Japan or didn't grow up here would find interesting because it has that kind of traditional town atmosphere. Maybe there's several mountains behind it. Maybe there's thatched roofs or this kind of thing. So yeah, there are tons of places to explore that are not crowded.
Do you think that happens? Um, it's like kind of a natural thing, or do you think that the Japanese don't tend to sell themselves, or don't sell the venues, uh, or as you say, because they lived there, they don't perhaps see the same significance?
It's, I think, potentially quite a big part of it is the language barrier. Because if you go to Tokyo or Kyoto, then you can definitely get by with English and without a word of Japanese, basically. And there are a lot of free tour guides and things as well who will sort of act as a translator or interpreter as you go around. So you don't really have anything to worry about. Whereas if you go outside of the major cities, Generally speaking, people are not going to speak English. They're not going to speak any other language other than Japanese, or maybe at some hotels, then they'll speak English, and then maybe some places might speak a very tiny amount of English. But, if you have like allergies or something, then that's really problematic because you can't express that you can't eat this particular type of food. They're not going to understand that at all. So I think that definitely has a part in people being a bit afraid to go to those kind of places.
But probably they need not be.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends. I think like these days, a lot of the translation apps and stuff actually work very well. And so if you kind of if there are things that you really need to have on your trip to Japan, then you should have a card. Like, for example, if it's an allergy, you should have a card that says both the English and the Japanese. And you can just show the person, like, I have this allergy, and then they'll either be like, okay, or they'll be like, no, like, because they can't deal with it, and this is the thing that just means no, like they do this or this, and it looks kind of intense to an outsider, I would say, but it's just like their clearest way of saying, like, no, that's not possible. In which case, for example, if you have a soybean allergy and the entire menu has soy sauce in it, then there's nothing that you can eat, so they can't actually do anything about it, for example. But yeah, so if you have those kind of, very specific issues that you need to be able to communicate to someone, then you should have like some kind of card. But otherwise, if you have like a portable Wi-Fi and you have any kind of translation app, then these days you can get by pretty easily with those.
Yeah, that's good advice. So I noticed you've taken some pictures of bridges, and of course it reminds me of a trip I did to Hong Kong,
Mm.
um, who also seem to like bridges. Do you think do the Japanese have, do they place a lot of significance on certain kinds of bridges, or perhaps culturally designed? You know, I always think of the Chinese, perhaps, for instance. They feel like if you walk over a certain bridge, then you leave your troubles behind. Is there a kind of similar sort of cultural significance with historical bridges?
That's a very interesting question. I've never really thought too much about bridges, but yes, that definitely does exist. There are even a few like specific, I can't remember where this it's either a shrine or a temple, but there's a specific one where you're supposed to walk across with your partner, I think, and then like blindfolded. Maybe that's not a bridge actually. That might just be you have to walk to a certain place. I can't remember, but there are definitely like a lot of these kind of traditions and things near temples and shrines. But the one, as soon as you said bridge, then I was thinking of this specific one in a place called Nikko, which is just north of Tokyo. And that one is quite a famous bridge because it's just very, very pretty in the autumn. I'm actually going to go there in a couple of weeks, and it's like one of those very traditional looking bridges with like the I don't know what you call them, but the ornaments at the end, and it is across this river, and then behind it it's almost like a valley with just all these beautiful autumn trees. And that's a part of, I think, Nikko Toshogu, which is a big temple area in that region. So there are definitely a lot of traditional bridges that have something to do with the shrine. I was actually going to also say there are some very interesting bridges, vine bridges down south, which I can't remember where the exact region is, but if you want me to find out later, I can tell you. But yeah, there are these vine bridges that people used to use to get between different parts of this very sort of remote, almost jungly area. And there used to be, I think, 12 of them, and now there's only 2 left that you can actually still use. But yeah,
Oh,
very interesting place.
no, incredible, isn't it? I mean, it's all part of our history. So I suppose, do you think history has a strong part to play in tourism?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think I think without history, then things would lack a bit of depth, I think, because you can do a lot of, fun modern things, and, there's a lot of interesting food that doesn't necessarily have to have much of a history behind it, um but I think, places that have some history behind them also have a history of how they've developed, and that can play into the architecture, or it can play into how the people working there act in the modern day as well. And so, yeah, even if you're not interested specifically in learning, like, oh, this place was built in the 1600s or whatever, it can still have an impact on what you're visually seeing and what you're experiencing as you walk around, because maybe it's all made of wood, whereas a modern building might be all made of cement and doesn't have as much character or something like that, or it's something that you're just used to seeing.
Yeah, and it also informs you of how the social history has evolved as well.
Mm,
You know, why a place uh, was inhabited to begin with, to
mm.
lose as well, which I find um, fascinating.
Do you have
And
a favorite historical place that you like to visit?
um, well, being English, I love the Tudor period, uh,
Mm,
just because of it had a very strong uh, link to wood being used in the designs of buildings, and it also strongly influenced shipbuilding as well. Uh,
mm.
who were very much linked together. In fact, a lot of British history is linked to the sea, shipbuilding, and different wood being used, and it, yeah, and I'm sure it's the same. I'm sure Japanese history has a lot of that included in it as well. Um, Talking of Chinese and Japanese, of course, one thing, oh, and the British too, we love drinking their tea.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
um, I've been to several places, been blessed to go to several places that have tea, and the variation is amazing. So, do you like drinking Japanese tea?
Yeah, I mean, I already liked, well, so I thought that I liked tea before I moved to Japan, but that was just me liking an English breakfast tea, and that was pretty much the only tea that I ever drank. But moving to Japan, then obviously their main thing is green tea. They do also have a lot of sort of variations of green tea, basically. So there's something called hojicha, which is roasted green tea, and then they use the same, you can use the same leaves. I believe it's something to do with how they're oxidized and things like that, to create different types of tea. And so, yeah, I have a whole drawer in my kitchen that's just tea. It's also quite, there's quite a culture of giving food, whenever you go, if you go to a different region, or if you're visiting a friend, then you should bring some kind of edible thing with you, to as a gift for them. And so we also receive a lot of tea, so we have several types of green tea in in that drawer.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I went to a tea museum in Hong Kong,
Mm,
and what was amusing was one, there's many varieties of tea, but
mm.
the Chinese don't know how many variations there are. There are thousands.
Yeah.
Is it so? It sounds like it's similar in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it kind of depends on what you categorize as each individual type of tea, because I think like basically there's loads of different tea making regions, and then within that they have specific farms, and then within the farm then they probably make more than one type of tea. So then if you're going by every farm's individual type of tea, then yeah, there's going to be so many that you just can't count them. But if you go a bit broader, then you can kind of categorize them into certain types.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I noticed was a bicycle, and I thought, oh, do Japanese people like cycling? Because I always
Was that in
thought,
my photos? Was that?
yeah, I saw one of the, and I just wondered, because in Britain we're trying to be more like, well, I mean the Dutch are probably the best when it comes to cycle friendly environments, but we do fairly well here. Um, how if you wanted to do cycling in Japan, is that possible?
It's funny that you should mention the Dutch, actually, because I think that particular photo was taken at a place called Kasamigaura, which is a place that has put in a concerted effort to make it good for cyclists, to the point that they have a lot of elements of things that are definitely taken from Dutch, sort of not architecture, but like Dutch elements. So there's actually a windmill around this. So Kasamigara is Japan's second largest lake, and there's a windmill there and a bunch of tulips in front of it usually. And windmills aren't a regular sight in Japan. And so this area, you can cycle around the whole lake. And then at the station, then there is a hotel that you can actually just take your bike into. And you can also take your bike through the station, which you can't usually do in most Japanese stations. So you can take your bike through the station, and then the hotel is connected to the station. You can take it straight into the hotel lobby and cycle your bike, well, not cycle your bike, but walk your bike to your room and put your bike in your room. Because they've made this very specifically to be as cycle friendly as possible. So there are a bunch of like cycle spots and rental spots and things like that. So there are a few places around Japan that are very, very cycle friendly, and that are kind of, they've made a concerted effort to do sort of cycle tourism. But overall, the cycling is a little bit hit and miss, because there's kind of, I mean, we definitely have this in the UK, where there's still a kind of unsure whether a cyclist is a car or a pedestrian. And so they end up kind of swapping between both, and kind of being on the pavement for a bit and then being on the road for a bit, kind of thing. But in general, in Japan, people will mostly cycle on the pavement. There aren't many. It's usually kind of more the people wearing the lycra and things like that that actually go onto the road. And so that can be a little frustrating. And it's also frustrating as a cyclist, because you have to be on the pavement, and then you're like getting in the way of people, and people are getting in the way of you. And there aren't like many dedicated cycle lanes in a lot of places. So yeah, it kind of depends on where you go. If you are an avid cyclist and you want to go to Japan and do cycle tourism, then there are specific places that are really good for that.
Mm. Oh well, it's good that they're thinking about it, and as you say, it takes a while to build up the infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I expect that's what you're seeing at the moment. Well, in terms of anybody new going into the country, what advice would you give them as travelers?
Um, hmm. I would actually say avoid Kyoto, because I think a lot of people want to go to Kyoto because they've heard the name and they've heard that it's very traditional and all the rest of it. But it is very, very, very crowded right now. And so it's not actually a very enjoyable experience because there are just so many people that you can't really, it almost feels like a tourism theme park. Like it doesn't feel, you go to these traditional older places, but you can't really feel that kind of history, the atmosphere or anything because there are so many people there and like everyone's got their phones out and everyone's you can't really feel the history of it. You can't feel that atmosphere. So I would actually say don't bother with Kyoto and instead go to one of the other many places that have history. I actually really like Kanazawa, which is a place that is kind of towards the west coast of Japan. And that place is also starting to get more popular, but it has the same kind of, if you're looking for those traditional buildings, it has an area called Higashichaya, which is like the old town area, and it is famous for its gold making. So if you walk around this little area, there's a bunch of like shops just full of gold statues and different gold things, and you can get I think one of my videos I talked about it, actually you can get gold ice cream. Like you get a soft serve ice cream with a sheet of gold over the top. It doesn't add anything to the flavor, but you get to take a picture of it. Yeah, so my advice would be to do a bit of research and to find what you're actually looking for. So if you're trying to look for something historic, then there are plenty of places that can do that. Just type historic towns in Japan. If you're looking for something artsy, just kind of do that and just try to get a little bit away from the usual Kyoto stuff.
Yeah. Do you think it's in terms of making decisions in advance, which kind of decisions do you like? Do you like to plan ahead or be more spontaneous?
I think I generally like to plan ahead to an extent. It does depend. I mean, for my work, then generally I have to plan very specifically ahead. But if it's sort of with someone or for someone who's just going for leisure, then my preferred method is to kind of have an idea of the things that you want to do and maybe some like can't miss spots. But and so for example, if you have a day's itinerary, then it would be like, okay, well I kind of want to go to this castle in the morning, and then I want to get lunch somewhere, and then I think I want to go to this area of town in the evening, and then if I have time, I'll also visit this thing. But so I like to know what's around and know the things that I want to see, but be a bit flexible in terms of the timetable, because sometimes, say you go to that castle in the morning, maybe it will take you actually all day because it has huge grounds and there's so much to see. Or maybe it's actually tiny and it takes you like half an hour to get around. And then you have a lot of time and you don't know what to do with it. So yeah, it's good to be flexible, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Ah, good advice. Well, one thing we do have in common is that we both like a bit of YouTubing. So
Okay.
tell me about your channel.
Yeah, sure. And then I'd love to hear about your channel as well. So I started my channel like 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I think. And it started as a recipe channel. And that was just for Japanese recipes that I wanted to share with English speakers. But it didn't really do very well. I think like I wasn't really thinking about what people were searching for or what they wanted. I was just kind of saying like, I really want people to know about this very niche type of Japanese cuisine, so I'm going to make a video about it. But I didn't have the audience in the first place, so no one's seeing it, so no one ends up learning about that niche cuisine. Um, so after a year or two of that not really going anywhere, then I was like, okay, maybe I should like pivot a little bit here. So I switched to trying to go to places that are making the food. So I went to a soy sauce brewer, I went to a wasabi farm, and I interviewed these people and I did kind of mini documentaries. But those took a lot of effort. Like as a one person project, it was very difficult. And so it took a lot of my time. It took a lot of planning, and it takes a lot of time on site and then a lot of time afterwards. So just overall a lot of effort and time. So now what I do is I am doing more travel related content, and I actually have some plans to amp that up quite a bit and do more sort of itineraries and have a bit more frequent upload schedule, so that I can give people more useful information about travel. But yeah, so that's and it's all about Japan, of course. What about you?
Well, this is my latest channel, so
Mm.
yeah. So I just love talking to people, and I thought, well, as I like doing that, let's have a movie.
Yeah.
So I do enjoy that. Um, I've done other channels which are currently in abeyance, but I like to do touring, so I may do more of that.
Would that be touring around the UK or
Uh,
abroad?
so yes, so far, I mean, it's in the UK base, but I'd like to do abroad. So I think
Mm.
that's kind of my next stage.
Mm.
Well, Cassandra, it's been absolutely amazing having a chat to you and learning all about Japan. So
Yeah,
uh,
thank you. You've been a great listener. I've talked so much.
no, that'd been my pleasure. It's the whole point. People like to hear stories from around the world, and hopefully people will be inspired to come and visit Japan.
Yeah, I hope so.
So yeah, well, good luck in all your video making and food discovery. Yeah, it sounds like there's um, a lot to discover in Japan. So yes,
Yeah,
good luck.
for sure. Thank you very much, and thank you. And I hope that your new channel goes well. I look forward to your future episodes, and thank you so much for having me on.
No, you're welcome.